Like everything else in the world, the video games industry is constantly changing and evolving. Industry trends, staples, and common practices often fade away and pass into memory, and in this feature, that's what we're talking about. We'll be talking about 10 things that were once hugely prevalent in the games industry, but have now either become very rare or have faded away completely. Invisible walls. Technology keeps advancing at a rapid rate, which means that developers constantly find themselves with new tools to create more ambitious and open games. One very particular byproduct of that in the last decade or so has been that artificial invisible walls that would prevent players from accessing areas in the world that should logically have been accessible are not nearly as common as they once used to be. Of course, we do still get some invisible walls, but thanks to games now being much more expansive than ever before, and the fact that developers have also gotten much better at masking what would have once been an invisible wall, means that this is an industry trend that has disappeared almost completely. Excessive QuickTime events. There was once a time, not that long ago, when QuickTime events were everywhere. Across genres and developers, QuickTime events had infested games like a plague. And sure, some were rather well executed. The old God of War games are a prime example of that. But the games that used them poorly or used them as a crutch far outnumbered those that used them well. Thankfully, this entire generation has seen those games becoming increasingly rare. QTEs haven't completely gone away, of course, but at least they're now used in moderation, and mostly only when they make sense. Unless you have to press F to pay respect, that is. Cheats. Unlike QTEs and invisible walls, cheat codes are an industry trend whose disappearance we're not happy with at all. Once upon a time, using cheat codes in games was perhaps the greatest way to enjoy them. The Grand Theft Auto series wouldn't be half as much fun without them, for instance. But for whatever reason, we don't see a lot of them in games anymore. The rise of microtransactions as well as video game patches and updates means that cheats of both kind, advertent and inadvertent, now no longer really have a purpose to exist. Things like secret costume unlocks or EXP boosts can easily be sold to the player for a few bucks, rather than handed for free by a secret code. While unintended cheats, such as the item duplication glitches in the old Pokemon games, can now be patched out as soon as they are discovered. Such can be the price of progress, we guess. FMV cutscenes. Games have tried to tell stories to the best of their ability for as long as they've existed, but it goes without saying that they were also often limited by technological restraints in that regard. The high production values and incredible cutscenes we see in games these days simply weren't possible during, say, the PS1 and N64 era, and so developers turned to other means to achieve similar effects. One of these was FMV cutscenes, and while they worked, at least for that time, they just never felt right. Jumping from gameplay to live action and then back to gameplay is jarring, even with the stellar-looking games of today's day and age. So imagine how jarring it felt with the blocky visuals of the late 90s and early 2000s. Stupidly obvious tutorials. Not too long ago, excessively hand-holdy tutorials were spreading like a plague in video games. And all too often, you'd play a game that would ingeniously highlight your health bar and say something like, "This is your health bar, it shows you your health." Okay, maybe that specifically never happened, but you get the point. The beginning of this decade, however, saw games such as Dark Souls and, strangely enough, Minecraft coming along and showing to developers at large that spoon-feeding players was not necessary at all. Just look at the progression from Skyward Sword, which bombarded players with painfully obvious and prolonged tutorials every couple of minutes, to Breath of the Wild, which doesn't have any tutorials whatsoever, in spite of its massive and expansive nature, to see the significant strides games have made in this area. Tacked-on multiplayer. Multiplayer and online gameplay caught on like wildfire in the PS3 and Xbox 360 era. And, as is the case with anything that becomes popular overnight, developers across the industry started chasing the trend. For some, it meant dropping single-player ambitions and putting all of their eggs into the online basket. For others, it meant cramming multiplayer modes into games where they had no business being. Mass Effect, God of War, Dead Space, Ninja Gaiden, and so many more made the baffling decision to include multiplayer modes just to chase the trend. Sure, some of them, like The Last of Us and the aforementioned Assassin's Creed, had surprisingly excellent multiplayer, but those were the exceptions to the rule. Tacked-on motion controls. Multiplayer wasn't the only thing developers were cramming into their games to chase a popular trend during the 7th console generation. The Wii was the most successful console that generation, selling over 100 million units, and its motion controls were massive. Both Sony and Microsoft decided they wanted a piece of that pie. They both went about it in very different ways though. Sony just copied the Wii wholesale with the PS Move, while Microsoft did whatever the hell the Kinect was. But both were maddening for the same reason. This was the reason we got games like Star Wars Kinect. To quote Adam Jensen, we didn't ask for this. Stereoscopic 3D. The early years of this decade saw stereoscopic 3D growing in popularity in all visual entertainment media, thanks primarily to James Cameron's Avatar. And Sony were leading that charge in the games industry. 3D support for the PS3 was something they banked on quite heavily for a good year or two, and it felt like nearly every major game releasing for the system supported 3D in some capacity. And of course there was Nintendo, who went one step further with the 3DS that lets you enjoy 3D without the need of 3D glasses. Of course it ultimately turned out to be a fad, but it was one that we're glad we got to live through. 3D may not have been as big as some were promising it would be, but it was definitely fun while it lasted. Black and white moral choices. Morally grey decisions are not a new thing in video games, and at least in CRPGs have been around for decades. But moral choices in the mainstream AAA industry were too binary for far too long. You could either be Superman or General Zod, there was no middle ground, and whatever choices you were making were always very clearly delineated as good and evil choices. The infamous and Fable games are perfect examples of this problem. Thankfully, decision-making and writing in games have both matured enough by now that such black and white choices are now quite rare. Actual manuals in physical releases. In today's day and age, even physical games in and of themselves are becoming less commonplace as digital media takes everything over. But back when physical media was at its peak, something else that went hand in hand with discs and cartridges of games was manuals. Actual, fully fledged, thick manuals, complete with instructions, information about controls, wonderful art and illustrations, and often even flavor text about the game's world, characters, and lore. That's a practice that is pretty much entirely non-existent now. Publishers just don't see the sense in investing that much time and money into crafting these fully fledged manuals and then printing them out on a large scale. Especially not when they can sell those things as special goodies in costlier collector's editions of the games. And that wraps it up. If you like what we're doing, please consider subscribing to our channel. We upload new videos daily, so make sure you don't miss them by subscribing. We appreciate your support, and we thank you for checking us out.